Hello everyone, it's AG. So at the start of 2020 I had set out to read classics. It's something that I had always wanted to do but just felt far too intimidated to even give a try, and so now 1.5 years later I have read quite a few classics and have learned quite a lot along the way. And so today's video is my personal guide on how to read classics, so how to get started, where to find them, etc, etc. So this video is split up into 4 pieces. So in part 1 we will be talking about the concept of a classic and I guess kind of like recalibrate our perspective on that. The second part will be on ways to find classics that might suit you best. The third part will contain advice and some tricks on how to better understand classics. And then in the fourth part I will be talking about the places I go to in order to find classics to read. Okay, so let's start. The first thing that I have for you is a challenge. So if you could please name 3 classics at the top of your head. I'll give you 10 seconds. Okay, how many of these classics were written by either a white man, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, or Virginia Woolf? Leave a comment in the comment section, I guess. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that I think that for most of us, our perception on what exactly a classic is quite narrow. And I think that it is a hurdle a lot of people struggle with. I did as well. And you know, I could make an entire video about the grievances I have with regards to many literary canons. But to put things concisely for this video, there is a lot of elitism, dare I say even pretentiousness, surrounding classics. And this is a consequence because of the fact that for the longest time, reading was a pastime that was only reserved for the people who could afford buying books and also had the time to actually read them, i.e. the rich and elite. And now if you were to take a look at the academic space of literature, you'll find that for the longest time it has been rich upper class men who got to decide which books got remembered and revered as a classic and which pieces ought to be forgotten and lost to time. And so now when one searches the internet for lists of classics, they'll find at best lists that are comparatively generic or at worst are painfully boring and or illegible to the average modern reader. So what's the solution here? Well, we have to change our perspective of classics being these long, boring and complex stories written by stuffy old men about lamenting about the human condition to something broader. So let's start by looking at the definition of classics, which is actually quite interesting because it's rather ambiguous. There isn't a set criteria as to what makes a classic and what doesn't. Most often though, it is based on persistence of popularity with regards to reading for leisure and or academia. Important to note though is that this popularity often still is based on the opinion of the upper echelon of society. There's also something called a forgotten classic, and this is a piece of obscure literature that hasn't really been widely read for many decades or even centuries, but then all of a sudden a person or a group of people sort of rediscover it, and then it gets revered as this long forgotten masterpiece that everyone now has to read. As for my personal definition, I really don't care what other people think, and so I consider classics to be just simply works that were written before roughly 1970. So essentially books that are at least half a century old. I would also like to strongly point out that with me saying all of this, I'm not trying to discredit classics that are very popular or widely read, I most definitely recognize the merit that they have and acknowledge the significance that they have had and still continue to have on our society and history. The point that I'm trying to make is that the range of the selection of classics that almost get recommended to death is so small in the scope of world literature that as a result, almost by default, they're bound to not be appealing to a lot of people. I mean, even if you look at most Western literary canons, you'll find that for the most part, they will consist of British, American, French, German, and Russian literature. In comparison, there is very little from Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, etc. And it's not like due to these countries having a lack of literature coming out of them. I mean, I grew up in the Netherlands, and during secondary school, we had to actually read quite a few Dutch classics, and there were just so many to choose from. But if you go and look at these long lists of classics, the only one that you'll mostly find is Max Havelaar by Multatuli. And that's it. When I started my classic literature journey last year, I had set out to read one classic every month. And so in January, I made a video showcasing my selection of classics. And there was one person who called me out for it because my stack consisted of one Dutch classic, one Nigerian one, and in total, I believe all classics were written by men except for one. This commenter indirectly and calmly called me out for having such a generic stack of classics, and it was that moment that I realized, like, whoa, I already have kind of like these preconceived notions on what exactly a classic is, and that is when I really started to broaden my perspective. And I feel that that is exactly the thing that led to my success in terms of like now really being into classics, because there were certain pieces that I read last year, such as No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai, Kokoro by Natsume Soseki, Childhood by Tove Ditlevsen, and Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, that where was I going with this? Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that those were the books that really mesmerized me and captivated me, and I was just so enthusiastic about talking about them on the channel, and they really lit this fire inside of me. I know this sounds really intense, but if I would have stuck to that original stack of books, I wonder if I would actually have still been reading classics as avidly as I still do now. So, in short, a summary of this section is broaden your perspective in terms of classics, because that will make it far easier for you to find books that are more suitable for you in terms of taste. So, part 2 is all about how to select classics that might be best suitable for you. So, when you're first starting off reading classics, it can actually be quite daunting to, read a full-blown novel. So, my advice would be to just start off with short story collections. And so within a short span of time, you can really discover the range of a single author, or if the story collection that you're choosing from contains various authors, you get kind of like a sample of different writers. So if you find a piece that you really like, you can look up the author and see if they have more short story collections or if they have novels, and then you can go and try those out. Penguin Classics actually has a neat series of short story collections. They have Dutch short stories, Italian, French, Russian, American, and British, I believe. And also in that same scope of, short story collections, you can also try and read children's books. Often the stories there are short, and if they aren't, they are rather legible, or comparatively more legible than like your quote-unquote adult classic pieces, because of course they are intended for children. Penguin also happens to have a series called Puffin Classics, which contain classics for children. So they have tales from India, Africa, the Caribbean. They also have very popular ones such as The Secret Garden, Gulliver's Travels, what else? Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, all of that and more. Something even shorter than short stories are poems, so you can start there as well. And a lot of authors from the past were both poets and writers of longer form literature, and so you can do the same thing of just checking out a couple of poems, seeing if you vibe with them, and then trying to see if this author also has some longer pieces as well. And if you are new to reading poetry and need some advice on how to start, I also have a video on that, so I'll leave it in the card up above here, I think, and also in the description box. Now, if you already are an avid reader of contemporary literature, one piece of advice that I would like to give you is try and look for classics that are of the same genre as the contemporary literature that you like to read. So if you are a huge horror fan, try and look for horror classics. If you love science fiction, try and find some sci-fi classics. I can guarantee that it significantly increases your chances of finding a piece of classic literature that you'll like. And that is because there's a huge chance that the classic that you have picked from a specific genre has either indirectly or directly influenced the contemporary literature that you're reading currently. And so another thing that you can do is, instead of looking within a specific genre, you can actually look at some of your favorite authors and see who they were influenced by. And doing so, you can rather quickly build up your own network of authors who have directly and indirectly influenced one another, and try and see if there's any work from those authors that you may be interested in. And this is quite an effective and easy way of finding classics that match your tastes. I have done this quite often myself. I'm a huge horror fan, and so rather quickly you'll end up at Edgar Allan Poe, and through him I've been able to find amazing authors such as Horacio Quiroga, Edgar Allan Poe, and Machado de Assis. We have finally arrived at part 3, and this is all about truly understanding what we're reading. And I found that the key to this is actually awareness. More specifically, awareness of the fact that the author that you're reading is living, or I should rather say, lived in a reality that is most likely completely different from yours, both in a temporal and cultural sense. I mean, if you look at our history, so much has changed in just the last 2 decades. So you can imagine how different the world looked like several decades ago, centuries ago. What happens when you're reading a classic is that you are reading a text essentially out of context. There are so many things about language that are so specific to the place a person lived in and the time they lived in. And so when you're reading something that was written like a century ago, you are going to miss quite a lot. A lot of things are just going to fly over your head, and that just increases the more you start branching out and reading literature from different countries, different continents, etc. And so in order to increase your understanding of the classic that you're reading, and thus most likely also your enjoyment, you need context. And you can get that by doing your own research. For instance, I have read many modern Japanese classics from the early 20th century, and I just found that after doing a lot of research about that period and the period prior to that, I just understood far more about the literature that I was reading, and I really started to get into it and just fall in love with the literature. Oh my gosh, that sounded so cheesy. But yeah, it's just incredibly enlightening, and it felt like I was discovering something new, even though I wasn't. But to me, I just got a lot of excitement from putting things into context and understanding when someone was referring to something very specific that you could only have known if you knew about like the history of that time, if that makes any sense. So once you have selected your classic, where do you start with the research? My advice would be to look up the author on Google or Wikipedia and read about their life. You'll often get actually quite a lot of context from that alone. You can then continue and look at the time and place where they lived and try and read up on that. You can also try and find out more about their interests, although that is like an extra step, but sometimes that can be incredibly helpful, especially for an author such as Borges, who had a lot of interest and read quite a lot. And so when reading his work, it can sometimes get rather tricky and hard when you know little about, for instance, Christianity or Islam or philosophy in general. But yeah, that is actually quite a unique case. A simple way of understanding a classic better is just by getting an annotated version. With these annotated classics, either in the margins or at the back of the text, you'll find extra notes that will explain certain passages and put them into context so that you'll get a better understanding of the piece. This video is starting to look like an ad read for Penguin, but yes, a lot of Penguin classics actually have these annotations. Sometimes they're substantial, other occasions they leave quite a lot to the imagination, in my opinion. But if you look specifically for a classic and add the word annotated, especially popular ones, you'll find explicit books that will say annotated blah 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 classic, and those are the ones that are rather extensive and will give you quite a lot of information. Another thing that you can do is check out reviews on YouTube. And am I saying this because I have quite a lot of book review and recommendation videos on classics on my YouTube channel? Yes, but also because it's just a very nice way to, first of all, find classics that you might have not found on your own, and, you know, gain new insights on the piece that you've read or that you're planning to read on. That you're planning on reading. Yeah. So with that, I'm going to plug myself. I'm actually starting a new podcast. I already have a knitting podcast and an anime, weeb, manga podcast as well on this channel. So it did not feel right to not have a podcast in which I just talk about literature for like whatever amount of time. So yeah, that's happening. It's called the LPA podcast, and I'll just be going over the pieces that I'm reading, some pieces that I've recently acquired, etc. Just a lot of like rambling stuff like in like in my other podcasts. So yes, do keep an eye out on that. Now, we have finally arrived at the last part, and this is where I share with you some of the places I go to in order to find classics. And You know, I have been reviewing books online for a good 3 years now, and so I have searched many places to find certain types of books. And what I found is that in the end, like, if you keep on doing this, you'll find specific publishers which you will vibe with. Is that even correct English? Yeah, you'll find publishers that will be to your liking more than others. And with these publishers, often you'll find that they themselves have like their own tastes. So they will sometimes specialize in one specific thing, or an imprint of the publisher will specialize in one specific type of genre, category, what have you. So the first one, of course, is going to be Penguin Classics. I do have to say, like, they are one of the best publishers out there when it comes to publishing both popular classics and more obscure ones. Definitely in the last decade or so, they have really made an effort to add classics to their collection from all over the world. I mean, I have found Danish, Norwegian, Brazilian, what's also not very popular, Maori classics, Native American classics as well. So yeah, that's Penguin Classics is actually my go-to publisher, but I have many more. Another publisher which I really appreciate is New Direction Publishing. From my understanding, they publish quite a lot of Latin American classics, obscure European ones. They also have a few Japanese ones as well, and yeah, they have like a huge variety. Same goes for New York Books. They actually have, I think, maybe like 5 or 6 African classics, which is quite rare for a lot of publishers. I find it quite hard to find African classics in general, so they have like a neat tiny selection. So if you're looking for that type of literature, you can check it out there. And also Pushkin Press. I do believe that Pushkin Press is more focused on European classics, though they do have some from Japan again, and also a couple from Latin America. So yeah, those were actually my top 4 publishers. Penguin, like I said, is definitely the best, has the widest range, and it's just like superb. So yeah, I even completely forgot. If you do not mind not reading physical books, you can also try and find classics on GUTENBERG.org. This is a website where they publish books which copyright has since expired. The only downside to this website is that there is a significant less amount of translated literature available there, and this is simply because translations also have copyright, and so often translations have come several decades after the initially published pieces, and so yeah, it's just going to take a couple of more decades for Gutenberg to get more translated literature out there on their website. But yes, that's it, I think, for the video. I know this has been highly requested from me for months now, and so I'm very happy that I was able to put this video together, and I hope that it was helpful for you. If you enjoy the content that I make on this channel, you can support me by liking, subscribing, hitting the bell button, commenting. You can also join my Patreon. I have a monthly book club there. We also have a Discord channel server, yeah, and much more. You can also support me by gifting me a coffee. And I think that's about everything. Yes, thank you very much for watching again, and I hope to see you in another video. Cheers!